Hi everyone. Today we are going to take a look at variables and also working with fractions, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing fractions. A lot of this should just be a review for us in Algebra 1. Okay, so to start off, we'll take a look at variables. So a variable represents a number. Sometimes it's an unknown number. It's kind of like a placeholder. So instead of working just with numbers, we could also put in a variable and say, this could be a different number, or this is a number we don't know, or we could change this depending on the situation. So variables are kind of like placeholders, and we usually use letters to represent variables. And you can use many different letters. In Algebra 1, you'll often see x as the most used variable for, or used letter for a variable. Sometimes we'll be asked to plug in numbers, or we'll set a variable equal to a number, and then we'll be asked to evaluate an expression containing that variable. Okay, so what that means is we might be given an expression like 3x plus 2, and then we might be asked, what is 3x plus 2 when x is equal to 4? So they gave us a value for the variable, and they're asking us to evaluate or simplify this expression. What we do is we just take the x, and then instead of having a variable there, we'll replace it with the 4. One note is we do want to make sure that we use parentheses when we do this. So parentheses, 3 times, in parentheses, 4. In this case, the parentheses don't make a big difference, but if we have a negative number, for example, they do make a difference. So we want to use parentheses, plug it in, and then add 2. 3 times 4 plus 2 is going to be 12 plus 2, which is 14. So that would be our answer to this question. What is 3x plus 2 when x equals 4? Same thing if we have variables squared. What is r squared plus 1 if r is equal to 3? In parentheses, we plug in the 3 where the r is, square it, and then add 1. 9 plus 1 is 10. So just kind of a recap of what a variable means. It's kind of like a placeholder. It could represent a number. Sometimes we'll be given the value of a variable and asked to evaluate. Often we'll also be given an equation and then asked to find what variables make this equation true or work out. But that's for another video. Next up, we're going to take a look at fractions, at working with fractions. So adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions. Okay, so with fractions, we can add or subtract fractions if they have the same denominators. Okay, so just some quick vocabulary, quick recap. Denominators are the bottom part of a fraction, denominator, and numerators are the top part. When we use these words, that's what we're referring to, the bottom part and the top part of a fraction. So we can add two fractions, and we can specifically add or subtract the numerators if they have the same denominator. For example, if we have 3 halves, 3 over 2, and we're adding 5 over 2, these have the same denominator, 2. So we can take the numerators and add them together. 5 plus 3 is 8, and the denominator stays the same. We get 8 over 2, which if we simplify gives us 4. So if we have the same denominator, we can add or subtract the numerators. One problem you might run into is often you'll be given fractions with different denominators. In that case, we need to work with these fractions in order to end up with the same denominator. And we can do that by finding the least common multiple. So we can work with fractions. Work with fractions to get the same denominator. We can work with fractions to get the same denominator. And an example would be if we have 1/2 and we're trying to add 1/4. So here we have different denominators, so we can't just add the numerators. However, we can make changes so that we end up with the same denominator. And what we need to do is look at the two denominators and find the least common multiple. Also shortened sometimes to LCM, least common multiple of the two denominators. So in this case of 2 and 4. Least common multiple just means the number that both, we can think of it as multiply into, number that both 2 and 4 multiply into. So we're looking at the two denominators and we're trying to find what number can we multiply the two denominators by some whole number and end up with that common multiple. So for 2 and 4, we could take 2, multiply it into 2, and end up with 4. And then we know 4 times 1 equals 4, so our least common multiple is 4. Okay, when we find a least common multiple, then we want to change our denominators so both of them end up with that least common multiple. What that looks like is for 1/4, we're already done because we already have 4 in the denominator. For 1/2, in order to get 4 in the denominator, we have to multiply by 2. We run into an issue here though, because if we multiply by just 1/2, for example, we're changing our number on the left. We're halving the number on the left. So what we end up doing is we multiply the denominator by 2, but we also multiply the numerator by 2. So whatever we're multiplying by to end up with the least common multiple, we multiply both the denominator and numerator. And the reason why we do this is, notice this part here, this multiplication, is just 1/2 times 2/2 is 1. So when we multiply by 1, we aren't changing the number at all. So we are sticking with our original expression that was given to us. So we're not making changes, but we can still end up with that common denominator. Okay. So here we're multiplying. 1/2 times 2 halves gives us 2/4. And now that we have the same denominator, we can rewrite it as by adding the numerators, 3/4, and that is our answer. Okay, so one note is finding a least common multiple is the best way to work with denominators that are different numbers. Another thing you could do, you could always multiply the two denominators. You could always take 2 times 4 to get a common multiple. It's not the lowest one, but it's a common multiple. And then use 8 as your goal. However, sometimes you'll end up with really large numbers and it'll be harder to work with. So I do recommend trying to find the least common multiple when you're trying to add or subtract fractions with different denominators. All right, so next I want to just briefly talk about multiplying and dividing. And then we'll go through another example. For multiplication of fractions, we take the numerator and multiply it by the other numerator. And we multiply the denominators. Denominator. So we multiply across the top and across the bottom to end up with our answer or result. So what that looks like is if we have 3/4, for example, and we're multiplying that by 5 halves. So here we can multiply the tops. So 3 times 5 is 15. 4 times 2 is 8. So 15/8 is our final answer for multiplying those two fractions. So just multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms. For dividing, what we can do is take the reciprocal of the fraction we're dividing by. So a quick example is if we have 10 thirds and we're dividing 10 thirds by 6 fifths. What we can do is take the fraction we're dividing by, take the reciprocal, which just means we're going to flip the fraction. The numerator becomes the denominator, and the denominator becomes the numerator. Take the reciprocal, and then multiply by that reciprocal. So what that looks like here is we have 10/3 times 5/6, which gives us 50/18. And we can simplify that by dividing the numerator and denominator by 2. 25/9. 25 divided by 9 is our final answer to this division problem. Okay, finally, I want to go over one more example of adding and subtracting fractions with different denominators. Here we have 5/6 divided by, 5/6 minus 2/7. So notice we have different denominators, so we need to find the least common multiple. One way to find the least common multiple is to look at multiples of one of the numbers and then see if the other number multiplies into any of those multiples. So multiples of 6 are 6, 12, 18, and you can check all of these to see if 7 goes into any of them. So far, 7 does not multiply to any of these. We have 24, 30. In this case, 7 doesn't end up multiplying into any of them until we get to 7 times 6, which is 42. So 42 is our least common multiple. Next, we take a look at our two fractions, and we want to, again, end up changing our denominator so we have that least common multiple in the denominator. So we have 5/6 minus 2/7. First, looking at 5/6, we need to multiply 6 by 7 to get 42. And again, to keep our number the same, to not change it, we need to multiply the numerator by 7 also. For 2/7, we need to multiply 7 by 6 to get 42. And so we'll multiply the numerator by 6 as well. Okay, so we can multiply the numerators and denominators in each case. Here we get 35 divided by 42 minus 12/42. And finally, we have the same denominator, so we can go ahead and subtract those numerators. 35 minus 12 gives us 23. And then we have that same denominator, 42, in the denominator. So 23/42 is our answer to this subtraction problem. So again, we want to find least common multiples and then make changes to the fractions so that we have the same denominator, which allows us to add or subtract the numerators.